So far we've talked about how Spain here was claiming land in North America. Then we talked about how France was claiming land in the northern part of North America and also down the Mississippi River. There's a third country that's going to want to get into the action, and that's England. Right here it says UK. This is England here, this part in yellow. Eventually England become known as United Kingdom. So they also wanted control of land in the New World. So they're going to try to send people over there to claim this land. And so in 1858, Queen Elizabeth was in charge of England, and she gave Sir Walter Raleigh a charter. That term charter is basically an official piece of paper, official document says you can do something. You have the right to do this. That charter told Walter Raleigh that he was supposed to start a colony as a way to make money off of gold and any other things they can find that would make money. So Raleigh was going to call this new colony Virginia, named in honor of Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin or Unmarried Queen. So he sent out some explorers there. So Sir Walter Raleigh decided upon what is now known as Roanoke, North Carolina. So about 100 people were sent to this island, which they called Roanoke Island. They were not very well prepared. They didn't know how many supplies to bring. They didn't really plan it. They didn't plant any crops. They tried just relying on trading for food with Native Americans nearby. Well, some of the Native Americans didn't want to trade, so the colonists started stealing food, and that led to some fighting. Colonists didn't find any gold, so after a tough winter, they gave up. Like, we're going back to England. Nope, we don't want to do it. So Sir Walter Raleigh's first attempt at settling North America failed right in this area there. It just was not a good first start. England's not going to give up. So a gentleman by the name of John White in 1587 is going to try again. So he takes a second group of colonists to settle in Virginia. Well, the supplies are running low, so White said, okay, I will go back to England to try to find more supplies. Well, when he finally did get back to England, England and Spain started fighting in a war. And England did not have any ships to spare to send John White back to the colony. And it took a couple of years until he was able to get back. When he got back to the colonists had disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to them. That's why we call it the lost colony of Roanoke. There's a few theories about what happened. One is that the colonists died of either starvation or disease or were attacked by Native Americans. Or another theory is the colonists just moved and started living with Native Americans. So no one knows for sure. So again, that's why we call it the lost colony of Roanoke. So far, England is 0 for 2. So England is going to try it again. This time it's going to be a little more successful. So now Queen Elizabeth is no longer in charge. King James I is in charge, and he gives a charter, remember one of those permission slips, to a company called the Virginia Company. So the Virginia Company sent 144 men and boys to start a new colony. They landed on a place that we now call the James River, named after King James, and they built a settlement, and they called it Jamestown in honor of King James I. They were led by a gentleman by the name of John Smith. John Smith was a very good leader, and he came up with a rule that is plainly says, those who don't work, don't eat. If you want to get food, you need to work. You need to help the colony. So it worked. But then what happened? In 1609, John Smith was injured and had to return to England. Without his leadership, things started to fail a little bit. And the winter after he left became known as the starving time. And only 60 of the settlers had survived. So it was a tough winter without John Smith's leadership. But then it started to look a little better because they discovered how to grow tobacco. And they had just started learning about tobacco in Europe. So the number of people that wanted tobacco was going up. Don't do tobacco. Bad for you. Just saying. So John Wolfe ended up being the first one to have a successful crop. And this term here, cash crop. A cash crop is something that is grown to make exactly what it says. Cash, money, it wants to make a profit. So tobacco became a cash crop for Jamestown. And because of tobacco, Jamestown became very successful. And so England's third attempt at colonizing the New World worked in Jamestown. But the problem with tobacco, it takes a lot of space for tobacco plant to grow. So they needed people there to work. So they came up with the idea of something called indentured servants. Basically, what indentured servant says, yep, I will work for you for 5 to 7 years. In exchange, you'll pay for my way from Europe to get over here, and I'll work for you. And then when I'm done, indentured servants would get land and a home and clothes after they did their 5 to 7 years. So basically, again, what an indentured servant is saying, I'll work for you for a certain amount of time. At the end, you give me these things. A lot different than slavery. I don't talk too much about the House of Burgesses. That is just what Jamestown called their government when it really started to get big and successful. So that's what they had to run their colony. The Powhatan are nearby Native Americans. At first, things were a little peaceful, but then the Powhatan at one point did attack. And because of those attacks, King James said, Virginia Company, you are no longer in charge of this colony. I'm taking it over. So Jamestown then became owned by the king. And then eventually Jamestown would become a part of the colony of Virginia, bigger piece. And so here you can see where Jamestown is on this map here. And right below it is where they had the 2 failed attempts at Roanoke. So I'd like to do right now is show you a video about Jamestown.
Explorers discovered America in the 1400s, and they came back saying there was a lot of land and gold there. European countries soon went back and claimed land for their own. More land meant more power. England wanted more power, so they sent settlers to America to set up a colony. The first 2 colony attempts failed. Settlers tried to settle Roanoke, and the first time they came home because they had a hard time farming and surviving the winter. The second time, settlers tried to make a life in Roanoke, but after a supply ship returned to America, they discovered the settlers had mysteriously disappeared, and it still remains a mystery to this day. The third and only successful attempt was Jamestown, which was in the area we now know as Virginia. The area they settled was named Jamestown after King James I in England, who gave the Virginia Company of London the charter to settle in the New World. Settlers chose the area of Jamestown for its deep waters for docking their ships and fresh water for fishing. It was also a good location for fighting off the American Indians if they needed to. The settlers of the Virginia Company of London landed on May 14, 1607. There were 104 people, just men and boys. There were blacksmiths, bricklayers, some carpenters, 2 surgeons, and laborers. The first thing they did was build a fort with 3 watchtowers. Inside the fort, they built a church, storehouse, and houses. After building a place to live, they set out to look for gold. The gold was supposed to be a source of trade for the settlers so they could get supplies from England for building their lives in America. But unfortunately, they found none. Then they tried making glass and silk and milling lumber, but none of these proved to be very fruitful. While they were trying to find a way to make money, many of the colonists died. By January 1608, only 38 out of the 104 men and boys were still alive. Many died from illness or hunger. That same month, the fort and most of their supplies burned in a fire. The colonists decided to try to make friends with the Powhatan Indians, but things didn't go too well. Their best hope was when Captain John Smith became friends with a Powhatan woman named Pocahontas. In spite of the friendship, the colonists and the Powhatan never quite trusted each other. The story of Jamestown is one of survival. There was a lot of struggle, but over a few years they found success. The settlement didn't go as planned, but it still began English rule in America.
So that's a quick little video about Jamestown. And so now that Jamestown was successful, England's going to try again. In 1534, King Henry VIII had left the Roman Church and started his own church, and he called it the Church of England. And at that time, everybody in England had to belong to that church, whether they wanted to or not. There were separatists, you can see right here, that wanted to separate and form their own churches. Well, again, under England, you couldn't do that. You had to belong to the Church of England. So many of them were threatened to be put into jail or fined. So one group of separatists, known as the Pilgrims, decided, we want to leave. Can we have permission to settle in Virginia? They were granted permission. So they got on the Mayflower, a very famous ship, and they took that to the New World. They were aiming for Virginia. They missed where they wanted to go. So if we look on this map, they were aiming for this area here. They missed. They ended up here. So this is where the Pilgrims are going to form their colony in a place called Plymouth. And they called it Plymouth because when they left England, they came from Plymouth. So they just kept the same name. So there you can see the ship, the Mayflower. And before they even got off that ship, they signed something called the Mayflower Compact. That was their agreement on how they were going to run their colony. When also in Plymouth, they had a rough first winter. They spent most of that first winter because they arrived late. They arrived closer to in the fall than they wanted to, so they didn't have time to plant or anything like that. So it was a rough first winter for them. But then after that, they met Wampanoag, were the nearby Native American tribes. They met a sachem from the Wampanoag, who was their leader, and they also met somebody named Squanto. Squanto knew English, and he helped the Pilgrims learn how to farm. So without the help of Squanto, who knows what would have happened? Because he taught them how to farm, how to hunt, how to trap things, and also where to fish. After their first successful harvest, the Pilgrims held a feast, which you can see in this picture. That feast was a celebration of their first harvest, and it's called the first Thanksgiving. Now, a lot of people think that's the first Thanksgiving we had in our country because we celebrate it every November. No, there had been Thanksgivings going on even prior to when the Pilgrims arrived. This one just became very famous because of the Pilgrims and all of that. But one interesting fact about the Pilgrims at this first Thanksgiving, they did not have turkey. They would have probably had venison from deer or goose, things like that. Turkey was not on the menu. Somehow it became associated with that. And then eventually Plymouth Colony would also become very successful, just like Jamestown did. Thanks for listening. Sorry this one was a little longer than usual. Take care. Bye.